Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So today I'm just going to give you really an intro on overall nutrition for triathlon. And, a lot of people say it's the fourth discipline, but I personally think it's the first, because if you're not eating well and taking care of your body, you really can't swim, bike, or run. So it's really critical that you're, taking care of yourself and giving proper fuel. As Hippocrates said, food is medicine, or let food be thy medicine and medicine be thy food. Unfortunately, a lot of physicians maybe don't follow that as much, since they don't think food affects the body, but we really know that we do. And I'm sure a lot of you can feel it on a training or racing day if you haven't been eating well, or if you haven't been sleeping well leading up to the session. So Nick, I think we've been working together I think this is starting our third year. Is that right?
Sounds good. Yep, I think that's right.
Yeah. So we've been working together. I started working with Nick first, and so it's been great. And I can't quite see close enough to see who's out there, but I have, I've met with many of you on an individual basis, and it's just been a great interaction, and I've really enjoyed it. So myself, I did my first marathon in 2000, my first triathlon in 2003. Pretty much got hooked and have been I do all distances. I've done 5 Ironmans. I've done Boston a few different times, and I just love the sport. So, and that's when this is my second career. I went back to school, I don't know, over 5 years ago. With a focus in nutrition, and then really looking at sports nutrition, because that's where my passion is. So I'm a master nutrition therapist, a certified sports nutrition consultant, and a bulk of my business is endurance athletes, but I also do work with non-athletes, and I focus a lot on health first, because if health is really important, and when our body is at its best health, we actually will perform the best. So my philosophy is health first, performance will follow. So there's a lot of nutrition challenges. And when I meet with clients or have a call to see if it's a good fit, a lot of times I hear a lot of frustration on the other end of the phone, just because there's so much information out there and so much conflicting information. And so the first thing we really have to figure out is, what are our nutrition needs? And it's really going to vary based on size, age, gender, fitness level, and what you need during training is going to be very dependent on your daily diet. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But, it can be really frustrating trying to kind of wade through all the information. And then once you figure out what your nutrition needs are, there's different ways to meet it, and depending on what kind of philosophy you follow, but there's a lot of different information out there. Back when Gatorade Sports Science Institute was first created, it was, we were told we needed tons and tons of carbs to fuel our racing and training, but before that, people were lucky in marathons to get water, so, and somehow they made it to the finish line. And then we want to use nutrition again to improve our overall health, and that's going to optimize performance. And, my philosophy is I'd like to have everybody still racing, into their 70s and 80s. And if we're still doing Ironman at that point, we're all going to qualify for Kona, just because of the fact that we're some of the few people out there still. So that's a success in my book. So determining nutrition needs. So we don't want to be, this moment when you're like, oh my God, I have to find a porta potty now on race day. We don't want that. We want to avoid that. But traditional sports nutrition, again, it's carbohydrate based. It's going to tell us anywhere that we need like 30 to 100 grams of carbohydrate calories per hour. And that's 250 to 600 calories per hour in total calories. And that's a lot. And I can tell you, nobody can absorb 600 calories per hour when they're training and racing. And so it's just there. And if you pick up a book's going to tell you this information, and they're going to give you one prescription saying, okay, this is what you need to do. But unfortunately, it just doesn't work that way. We don't all have the same needs. It needs to be individualized. And I mean, there's a lot of GI distress out there. You guys know it. You go into a porta potty, you see the evidence of it. It's gross. And, you know, it's just, it's out there. And some, you know, a lot of us have experienced it. And even Chrissy Wellington in her book, you know, she's like arguably one of the best female triathletes. And in her book, she says that she pretty much pooped her pants in every Ironman she did except one. And that's like not just World Championship Ironman. And so, but in my opinion, just because it's common doesn't mean it's normal and doesn't mean it should be happening. And so we really need to think about this when we're thinking about what we should be putting into our body. So why is it happening? Well, so when we're exercising, so we have two parts of our nervous system. We have the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So the sympathetic is fight or flight, and parasympathetic is rest and digest. And so our body goes in and out of these states. And, you know, ideally we're in rest and digest during meals, at night, when we're sleeping, and that's when a lot of the repair happens. But when we're training and racing, we want the sympathetic nervous system to be working because it's our fight or flight. It's sending out the blood flow to the muscles so that we can go faster. But what happens is it's going to pull the blood flow away from the GI tract in order to do this. And then when that happens, it's going to reduce intestinal motility. And intestinal motility is what's happening, the peristaltic movement that helps to move the food through. So what that means is we've got less movement while we're trying to cram all these gels and chews into our body. The body's just not able to take it down. And then when the motility is down, it's going to reduce the gastric emptying. So things are going to sit there. And some of you may have experienced that. You're sticking, you know, you're looking at, you've got your formula, and it's like, I have to get so much in, and you're putting it in on the bike, and then you go to stand up and you start to run, and you're like, oh man, this is not good. I personally was there in Coeur d'Alene, my second Ironman, and so then a lot of times people will then take a break and just maybe have some water on the run, and all of a sudden an hour later they're feeling really good. And that's because they've given their digestive system a chance to catch up with all that food that they've been putting in there. So that's where we don't want to over fuel, because that's just going to cause some issues. And then once you get to the run, you've got the pounding effect, and that's going to increase intestinal secretion. So then you've got more liquid going into the GI tract, and then that can lead to the diarrhea. And then when we're in dehydration and heat, it's a lot worse, because then we're going to be sending even extra blood away from the GI tract to our skin to help cool us. So a really good tip is, if it's a hot race, you're going to probably want to take in a little bit less sports nutrition than you planned, but you're going to want to take in more water with electrolytes. But if it's a cold race, you're actually going to want to take in more, because your body's going to be working harder and burning more calories to try and keep you warm on top of what you're asking it to do with the exercise. So that's a really good gauge to kind of go up and down. And I know, like, for instance, Coeur d'Alene is another, like, that I just mentioned, is a crazy race, right? One year it can be, the year I did it, it was freezing cold, and it typically was always freezing cold. And then we had a couple crazy years where it was over 100 degrees. So you have to be prepared on race day to adjust it a little bit, depending on what actually happens with the weather. So one of the big things that we want to focus in on is metabolic flexibility. So this would be a test that I did. This is actually on myself. And so here we have, and I don't know, it might be kind of hard for you guys to see, but this orange line at the top up here is the percent of energy that is coming from fat. And the green line is the percent of energy that's coming from carbohydrate. And so really our two main sources to make energy are fat and carbohydrate. We can use protein as well, but protein is going to go down the carbohydrate pathway. And we don't want to burn our protein, because our protein is our muscles, and that's the last thing we want to do, is breaking down muscles. So we really want to focus on, okay, can we burn fat and carbohydrate well? Because as the intensity goes up, so here I started really low intensity, 80 watts, 106 heart rate. And then I took it up every 5 minutes by 20 watts. And, you know, I end up here, the highest I go is 220. My heart rate gets up to 152. And so as we go up, the carbohydrate is going to start to contribute more to the energy, and fat is going to contribute less. And that is just a physiological thing that will happen with everybody. And that's why, you know, we need to think about, so say Nick has you doing a track workout, you're going to be up here more. So that is a point where you're going to need some faster burning carbs. But if it's an hour, you should have enough stored up. But if it's a longer distance, even an Ironman, even a half Ironman, maybe even Olympic, you can be up here where you're burning more fat. Because for me, say, I mean, when I'm getting to, so my crossover point was right about, it was probably more like 210 watts, but, and so for me to be, I'm not going to be racing at 210 watts. I mean, that's a pretty high wattage for me. I might be doing a shorter distance race at that, but you can see here, so my fat burn stays pretty high up until, and then it comes down quite a bit as I get up over 200 watts. And then it goes back to fat burning very quickly as I go down to 140 and 120 watts. And so I have tested a lot of athletes, and I have seen this look so many different ways. I've seen it completely flipped, where a multiple Ironman athlete will be burning more carbs than fat at a very low intensity. And that, we'll talk more about it, but that is determined largely by the daily diet. And that is also something that is very difficult to deal with when you're in a race, because if you're burning, say, 89% carbs, it's going to be really hard to replace those carbs and digest it well without discomfort. So that's where it's individual. We can't just take a textbook formula and apply it. So does anybody have any questions at this point? Okay, looks like a no. Okay, so one of the big reasons that this happens is the effect of insulin. So insulin is a hormone that our body makes. And so insulin is needed for anytime we eat a carbohydrate or a protein, our body will break down the carbohydrate to glucose, and our body will break down the protein to amino acids. So once they get small enough to that, they're going to leave the digestive tract and go into the bloodstream. So this purple area is the bloodstream. And then they will go, so the insulin is the blue dots and the glucose are the red dots. And so the insulin is going to have its little receptor here where it's going to lock onto, and it's a lock and key relationship where now it's going to lock into its receptor, it's going to turn the key, it's going to open up the path so that glucose can go in with some of the glucose carriers, the GLUT4 transporters. So it's going to go into the cell, and then at this point it can actually be used for energy. So let's say that this is a muscle cell and this is our cellular membrane here. And then, but what happens is, say that you've had a breakfast with oatmeal and maybe some coffee with some coffee made creamer or something like that, and maybe a banana. So that's pretty much all carbohydrate. So what's going to happen is it's going to get into the bloodstream fairly quickly. And so you're going to have this big dose of glucose that comes in. And then the body's going to say, we don't want glucose over a certain level in the bloodstream. It can be dangerous to the body. And so the body's going to say, I need to get that out really quick. So it's going to shoot out a whole bunch of insulin. So the insulin is out here now. And so the insulin's going to lock, but then the cell is going to say, okay, I have more energy in here than I need. I don't need any more right now. I don't need to rebuild any more glycogen. So I need you to send it out to the liver to make triglycerides. So when I see a cholesterol panel and I see triglycerides on it, I'm going to think more about carbohydrate intake with the triglycerides than I'm going to think about fat intake. So basically, if the body keeps getting this big dose of glucose, it's going to say, okay, I just need you to send stuff back to the liver anyway. So I'm going to shut off some of these receptors on the cell. So what happens is then the muscle is not as responsive. So when you're training and racing and you're taking in a gel or a chew or something, it's not going to get into the muscle as fast as it should, and it's not going to work as well. So we want these cells to be what we would call sensitive to insulin and not resisting the insulin. And unfortunately, muscles are the first cells to become resistant. Fat cells are the last because we have to shove it somewhere. And then what happens is, so say you've had that breakfast again, you wake up in the morning and your heart rate's kind of, or your blood sugar's kind of low, you have that breakfast, so then you're big up. And then you crash because it's going to try and get it out of there as quickly as it can. And then you kind of have a whole day where you're just up and down, up and down, up and down. I have a lot of clients that come to me and start this way. Was there a question? No, it's just me echoing, sorry. So there's a lot of up and down. And it's the same thing in a race where you might know, I remember back when I was feeling myself this way, I would know like every 40 minutes I need a gel. And then it became maybe every 30 minutes because I think my cells were getting less responsive to it. And, you know, so you take a gel, you feel amazing. Then you start to crash, boom, okay, time for another gel. And it's just this up and down, up and down, up and down. And if we can keep it more smooth, you actually feel much more stable throughout the day. You don't get hangry. You know, your energy, your mental focus is better. You don't have the afternoon crash. So all of that can really help it with that. And so another example of a breakfast that would do this would be like non-fat yogurt with fruit. Because all we're doing is spiking insulin. Fat is the only macronutrient that doesn't really need a big dose of insulin to get into the cells. So the big reason why insulin affects in this way, now we know, and insulin is important and we want it, but we just want to use it well. But what happens here is, so this is a fat cell, an adipose tissue. So we have something called hormone sensitive lipase. So I mentioned that the fat is stored as a triglyceride, which is 3 fatty acids attached to a glycerol molecule. So in order to start burning that, we have to go through what's called lipolysis. We have to break apart the 3 fatty acids and the glycerol molecule. In order to do that, we need a hormone called hormone sensitive lipase. So once that's broken apart, then the fatty acids can go through the bloodstream, get to the muscle, and we can burn it for fat. But our body will not make hormone sensitive lipase, you see here the minus sign, when insulin is over a certain level in the bloodstream. The reason being is that the body's trying to protect us, and so at the point when there's insulin out there, it's going to say, okay, right now we are trying to store things. We need to get things out of the bloodstream. So we're not going to release things in. So when we've been told to eat like 6 small meals throughout the day and eat 60% carbohydrates, all we're doing is really sacrificing our ability to burn fat. And then that causes us to have to be so dependent on these carbohydrates when we're training and racing. So that's where the daily diet is about 75% impact on how that metabolic flexibility chart is going to look for everybody. So there's some other, so the big benefits of burning more fat: as I mentioned, digestion is compromised. You have the consistent blood sugar. It's also reduced risk of injury, internal damage, and aging, because I like to think of, so carbohydrate is like kindling. So you put it on the fire, it burns a big boost. So sometimes we need it, right? When you're doing something that's a sprint or something, you need it. You need the carbohydrate. So it's going to give you a big dose. And then the fat's going to be more like the log on the fire. And if you think about it, there's a lot more debris in that campfire when we've been burning kindling versus the log. And the same thing is true in the body. The sugar is going to have more free radicals or reactive oxidative species, and it leads to more inflammation. So it just has more issues. It glycates the protein in the blood. So that's where like you actually get like, it's similar to like when you cook something with sugar, like a donut or something, you get that caramelization. That's actually happening to the blood cells. Hemoglobin A1C is a measure of that. So that's happening when there's a lot of sugar out in the bloodstream. So we really want to minimize that. It's also going to improve body composition. So the more we can burn fat, even if, like say an athlete, Zach Bitter's a high-fat ultra runner, high-fat eating ultra runner, he has probably 6% body fat. He has enough to do like a 100-mile run just on his body fat alone. And I'll show you in a moment. There's a lot of it. And then the biggest thing is it conserves glycogen. So if you can burn more fat, you can use your glycogen as sort of a slow bleed, and then you have it when you need that extra kick, and you don't need to take in as much. So, and then a big thing, so the availability of resources. So this would be a female athlete, 120 pounds, 15% body fat. So lean for a female. So she's going to be fully glycogen loaded. And this is preparing for a marathon where it's going to take her 19 calories per hour at her race pace to finish, or 19 calories per minute to finish the marathon. So let's assume she can be fully glycogen loaded. So 100 grams in the liver, 400 grams in the muscle. So that's going to give her about 2,000 calories, which will last her at her pace 105 minutes. Okay. So a little bit over an hour and a half. And then from fat though, she has basically 8 kilograms of fat, which is 76,000 calories. So she can go for 4,000 minutes. She can do 5 Ironman races basically with the body fat that she has. So it's there, but we just have to be able to tap into it, and then we don't have to take in all of the carbohydrates. So this was an interesting study. I don't know if any of you have heard about it. It's called the FASTER study, and FASTER stands for Fat Adapted Substrate Utilization in Trained Elite Runners. So basically they had 20 male ultra runners and Ironman triathletes. 10 of them were high carb, 10 of them were high fat. And some of the high fat, Ben Greenfield was one of them. Most of you probably know him. Zach Bitter, again, he holds the 100-mile record at 11 hours and 47 minutes on a track doing 100 miles. Can you imagine? But so they're high-fat athletes, and they're not slow by any means, right? Ben Greenfield qualified for Kona when he was doing this type of eating. So the high-carb people were eating 60% of their calories from carbohydrate, 25% from fat, 15% from protein. The high-fat athletes were eating 70% of their calories from fat, 20% from protein, 10% from carbs. So very, very high fat and low carb. And I don't have any athletes that are this extreme. And even Ben Greenfield discloses that trying to compete at Ironman and being this low carb was a hit on his testosterone and his thyroid. So this could be a little bit extreme. And most of them aren't on this all the time. They still use carbs strategically. But anyway, so what they did was they had to be on this type of diet for an average of, or for at least 9 months, but most of them were 20 months. And they had to run on a treadmill for 3 hours at 64% average of their VO2 max. And they had to wear the mask with it's what I use when I test. It covers your nose and your mouth. I mean, it would be pretty uncomfortable for 3 hours. So it's pretty amazing that they were able to do this. And so basically, this is what the results show. So they looked at the peak fat oxidation. So how much fat were they able to burn? And before the study, in sports nutrition books everywhere, it was written and believed that the maximum amount of fat we could burn was 1 gram per minute. And so after this study, so the average they found for the low carb, high fat athletes over here in the lighter blue, they were doing 1.54 grams per minute. And one athlete actually got up to 1.8 grams per minute. So they almost have to rewrite, the sports nutrition books based on this. And then the high carb, they were at 0.67 grams per minute. So if you think about it, that's a lot more carbs that they're going to have to replace. And then what was the maximum percent of energy that they were getting from fat? So the high fat group was 88%. And again, one athlete was up at 98%. And you saw my data at when I came back down to 120, I got up to 91%. And the high carb was 56% was coming from fat. And then the percent of VO2 max at the peak fat oxidation. So how high were they able to get? So for the high fat, it was 70%. For the high carb, it was 55%. So that shows you too that you can still go higher intensity. And so it's not just instantaneous that, okay, if I start to burn fat, I can't go high intensity. That's not true at all. And And the other thing that's really interesting is they did muscle biopsies. And so they looked at the amount of glycogen. And so they did it before and they did it right after they finished. And then they did it after a recovery meal 2 hours after that. So the amount of utilization was very similar. And then so for their recovery meal, the high fat were given a shake with 5% carbs only. And the high carb was given a shake with 50% carbs. And after the 2 hours, they were both restoring. They both had restored the same equal amounts of glycogen. And that's because as you become more conditioned as a higher fat athlete, your body is able to make that glycogen without needing all those amounts of carbs. You're much more efficient at taking it and restoring it. So any questions so far? Okay. All right, so what does this mean from a nutrition standpoint? What do we want to do? So I'm a believer that we want to give our body what it recognizes and what it knows how to break down, digest, absorb, and utilize. And so that's real food. So I took this from Sean Croxton, so JERF, just eat real food. So we want to do that. And you really want to look for nutrient-dense whole foods. And you'll see here, we're kind of changing the food pyramid, almost flipping it around. So at the bottom, we've got vegetables and fruit. Vegetables and fruit are carbohydrates. So this is not low carbohydrate per se. It's more of a controlled carbohydrate, and it's really getting rid of what I like to call garbage, right? So we're going to eat that, and then we're going to have our protein and fat. And protein and fat is a lot of times combined together, like say a piece of wild-caught salmon. That's a great fatty fish, so it's going to have the fat, it's going to have the protein. And then we use grains, as you need it. And I personally don't do any grains. The way I carb load for an Ironman is I'm going to have 3 sweet potatoes, say from Friday to Saturday night. But I do have athletes where we do use grains, and we just use them strategically again, because once you become better and more efficient at burning fat and carbs, you can actually use the carbs, as I like to call them, performance enhancing drugs at that point, because you will get this boost from them when you start to use them at the right times. And so we also want to periodize our nutrition during our training cycle, right? So let's say today you're eating a lot of grains and carbs. You're like a 50-60% carbohydrate person. So you might be working your way into it, where we're just going to take down, so the starch here is orange, we're just going to start to take that down. And then during base training, which most of you are probably past that at this point, but during base training, we would do simply protein and fat as a half of our intake, and the vegetables and fruit as the other. And one rule with fruit is don't eat fruit alone, because fruit has a lot of nutrients. It's a whole food carbohydrate, but at the same time, it has a lot of sugar, so it is going to spike the bloodstream. So that's where if we pair it with a fat, say nuts or nut butter or something like that, that's going to actually kind of stabilize it, so it doesn't go like this. It's just going to kind of go more of a steady up into the bloodstream. So, and then with the build, then we can start to add in some sports nutrition products. So your sessions are getting longer. So we still can focus mainly on protein and fat and vegetables and fruit. And then you start to add in your sports nutrition products. And then we get to the competition period. And then that's where you might start to throw in, like in my case, it's a starchy vegetable, but for a lot of people, it might be rice or quinoa, something that's a little bit more, less refined than say a piece of bread. But you're going to start to throw that in too. And again, you're going to use it around your races, things like that. And then the taper period, I think, is important to talk about, because with taper, a lot of people think we need to be loading on carbohydrates, but actually we don't, because if you load on carbohydrates the whole time, that's actually going to mess up your blood sugar for the race. And our volume is down, right? That's when you finally get a break from Nick. So you can, so then you're going to naturally store more because you're burning less. So that's where we take the sports nutrition products out during the taper, because you're not training that long, and you're going to still use your starch, but you're going to use it again more around the race. Have your protein and fat and your vegetables and fruit. So, so then we look at macronutrients. So if you're somebody that tracks your food, this can be helpful, but for some people, this is just too much data. But trackers that I like, MyFitnessPal. Another one I really like is Chronometer, because you get more information on the actual, all the nutrients that you're taking in. And as athletes, it's super important that we are getting more than the recommended daily allowance for our intake, because we're asking a lot from our bodies. So you might start here, again, you're going to start to taper down the starch, but in base training, you might want to be 50% fat, 30% carbs from vegetables and fruit, 20% protein. And I think 20% protein is a good number for most of the time. Unless you're recovering from an injury, you're going to need it to be higher, unless you're really trying to build muscle for some reason. Or if aging females, I think, after a certain age, we need to kind of protect the muscle breakdown. So we might want to have higher amounts. But then again, so you're going to add in the sports nutrition products here on the build, still going to go for 50% fat. And then on the competition side, you might turn down the fat a little bit, adding in the starches. We still want to have some good vegetables and fruit. And then as the taper, the fat might be a little bit higher because we're taking out the sports nutrition. But then the thing I want to say too about vegetables and fruit leading up to race, you want to back off on the raw vegetables. You don't want to have too much fiber going into the race. So say for an Ironman, I'm going to tell somebody their last salad should be, if the race is on a Sunday, your last salad should be maybe even Wednesday if you're prone to GI distress, maybe Thursday if you're not. And then after that, have cooked vegetables, and then have really kind of the softer vegetables the day before the race. Sorry, I already hit that. Okay, so the daily diet. So these are some pictures of what your plate might look like. And I really encourage people, so I have clients track their food intake before we meet, because that's the only way I can really see what's going on. But I really want people to become intuitive and just look at their plates. And so if you see these plates, it's mostly vegetables again. There's at least a tablespoon of fat on these vegetables, or here they're cooked in fat. These are both fatty fishes, so maybe you don't need to add as much fat to it. But then in this case, there's some skin on this chicken, which is great. But if it's a boneless, skinless chicken breast, there's really not much fat in there. So that makes it more important to add fat, more fat to the rest of the meal. And you can add fat by adding nuts and seeds, adding cheese, adding avocado, oils, things like that. And so you really want to make sure that you're getting enough of that. And then, and so that's really it's a very colorful plate. And it's a mixture of things. Always cook your cruciferous vegetables, particularly anybody with a thyroid issue. So that's really what you're going for, what you should have your plate look like. So nutrient timing is really important too, because that's going to affect, how well our engine runs. So this was a really interesting study. So it was a 6-week diet, or a 6-week study, and we had a 3-week induction phase with people, and then they split them up for 3 weeks during the experimental phase, and they put them into what was called a sleep low group or control group. And so basically the sleep low group was not given any carbohydrates in the evening, and the control group was. And so over here it kind of shows you a little bit about how it was. So and it's not low carbohydrate by any means. If you do the math on it, you'll see, but it's 6 grams per kilogram of body weight, total carbohydrates per day. So not low carbohydrate. So they both had that. So they both had the same amount of carbs. But what happened was they would do a high intensity workout in the afternoon, and then a low intensity workout in the morning. And so what they would do, the sleep low group would have really no carbohydrates after the high intensity afternoon session, and nothing until after that low intensity session the next day. And then the control group would have carbs immediately after the the afternoon high intensity, and sorry, that little thing up there, after the high intensity, and then they would have some before. So so basically what's happening here is that the control group would be fully glycogen loaded, and the sleep low group would be depleted in glycogen. Because again, this is just 3 weeks, so they're not adapted to this really. And that's the problem too with most of the studies that say that higher fat diets are negatively affecting performance. The problem is that most of these people are not adapted as long as they were in the faster study. But this study is actually effective for what it's going to show us. So what it's showing us is then they took the performance change. So they did a 10K test. And so the sleep low group, the 10K time went down by like 2.7%. And in the control group, the 10K time actually went up slightly. And then they tested cycling time to exhaustion. And the cycling time to exhaustion was 3% higher. So they were able to get 3% longer in the sleep low group. And then it was increased like a tiny bit in the control group. So that's positive performance changes. So then body composition. So the body weight went down by 1.4% in the sleep low group, and it actually went up a little bit in the control group. And then they looked at fat mass, which if we're losing weight, we want to lose fat, we don't want to lose muscle. But the fat mass decrease was 8.7% in the sleep low, and it was down 3.3% in the control group. So it was down a little bit there, but it was down much more dramatically in the sleep low. So, and again, this is the only difference here is nutrient timing. So when you're having your things. So I really encourage you to look at your training schedule. And like this weekend's a little bit different with the camp. It's pretty hard hitting, continuous volume. But on a weekly schedule, take a look at your schedule and time it. So say you have an afternoon track session or something, then you would want to have some more carbs at lunch. But then maybe for dinner, you don't actually need to. You just stick to the vegetables with fat and some protein. But maybe at lunch, you have a wrap with a tortilla or something, or some rice or some quinoa in your salad, something with a little bit extra carbohydrates, fruit, add in some fruit, something like that. And then trying to make sure to go into your lower intensity sessions a little bit more lower with lower carbohydrate before. So really timing those carbohydrates so that you're using them to your advantage. So recovery is another obviously really important thing. So protein is the focus with recovery. So the kind of the traditional sports nutrition thing of a 4-to-1 ratio of 4 carbohydrates to 1 protein, that's actually not necessary. We don't need to do that much because that's kind of just program you to be a carbohydrate burner. You probably need like 2-to-1, maybe 3-to-1, again, if you have a higher intensity session coming up, right? So you really want to focus on protein, but I will say, this is a big one, time to have faster burning carbohydrates. So I really am a big proponent of moderation and sustainability, making this something that can work for the rest of your life. So if you want, we all have to have treats and we all have to have things, and that's the time. If you want to have some bread, if you love having a bagel or you love having a cookie or something like that, pizza, you want to have it after those big sessions because your muscle cells are super responsive to insulin at that point. So it's just going to release what it needs to get those carbohydrates into the cells to restore the glycogen. So that's the time to have those things. And I encourage people to do and have some things that you enjoy, because if you miss them and you don't have them, then that can cause issues where you're just going to, go off the rails. And then antioxidants are very important. So burning fat, you're still creating some free radicals. Burning carbs, you're creating a lot more. But the way that our body, so basically it's got the loose electron, and if we can give it an antioxidant, that's going to pick it up, that's going to take, or it's going to donate to it, and then the antioxidant or the reactive oxygen species is quelled, and not going to damage our body. And so, but I will say, so studies have shown that supplemental antioxidants can blunt the body's adaptation. So when we're training, we're trying to build mitochondria. And so that adaptation can be blunted if you're taking a bunch of supplemental antioxidants. I do think that there are times, though, when it can be necessary. Say it's a very big training. Most of these studies are not done on, multiple Ironman triathletes. But really, if you can, you want to get it from food, because the body's always smart with food. It's going to take what it needs, and it's not going to take what it doesn't need. So that's where it's a lot of colors of the rainbow. So the berries, berries are a great fruit to have. Green tea, even dark chocolate, red peppers, vitamin C. So there's a lot of, you really want to focus on eating the rainbow for those antioxidants, particularly after training. And then if you're going and you're doing, like you have to drive somewhere to bike, you want to bring something portable with you. I love smoothies. I typically will have people make them and put them and freeze them. And then maybe you even still have to put them in a cooler if you're out there for a really long time. But with some good quality protein, maybe some coconut oil, some dairy alternative or milk if you can do that, and maybe a banana since you're recovering, some berries, something like that. And that's going to be quick. It's easy to digest. It's also a great pre-race food because it's liquefied, so it's easier to digest. There's some good bars out there. You want to focus on one that has more protein. Primal makes some bars from grass-fed collagen. Collagen's great for our recovery, for our joints. So that's great. And like fruit and nuts, that can be a good thing, like a trail mix, that works. And avoiding alcohol right after training is a good idea because that can blunt some of the training adaptations too. Kind of a bummer, but so you just don't want to have it right after you train. Now, after an Ironman, if you can drink alcohol, I think that's fine. But you've earned it at that point. And then, okay, so fuel during a workout. So it's really all over the place. So if you're a carbohydrate burner, that's where I'm not going to go as high as some of those traditional sports nutrition products. And what I've seen with testing athletes, most people need less than they're taking in. And so if you're a big carbohydrate burner, and you if you are, you get hangry, you get low blood sugar, you have to fuel a lot during your workouts, then you're going to need something maybe closer 50, maybe 90 grams per hour if you're a male with like a stomach of steel. And calories 250, I don't think, maybe 350, 400. I don't think 500 we can digest very well. But when you get to be a fat burner, you can really be down at like 10 to 40 grams per hour, 50 to 200. And this is much more doable for the digestive system. And and I know for me, so I did 2 Ironman races as a carbohydrate burner, 3 Ironman races as a fat burner. And after I would finish the first 2 I did, my GI tract was kind of wrecked after, and I had a hard time eating like the 2 days after. And now I don't take in a lot of food during the race, but I can eat right after. And a lot of people have damage to the GI tract after they finish a race, particularly if you use NSAIDs like Advil, Aleve, things like that. So that's definitely something I don't recommend. And then I know that Infinite is a sponsor for your Tri Club, and I think it's a really good product. I like it a lot. They are very conscious of something called osmolality, which is the amount of particles in the liquid. And so, and you don't want to have too many particles in the liquid. Say Gatorade, that's like a 6% solution. That's more, that has a higher osmolality than blood, so that means we need to take water from outside the GI tract in order to start the digestion, and to absorb it. That can lead to diarrhea. So Infinite is really, really conscious of the osmolality. And what I really like too is that you can customize. So for the athletes that I work with that use Infinite, we'll typically go in and we'll customize the, I'll have them test maybe the Go Far first, make sure they like it. And then we'll go in and we'll customize it. And typically what I'll do is I'll take down the protein and I'll increase the amino acids, because remember, amino acids are the building blocks of protein, and protein can be hard to break down while we are training and racing. So if we can just take the amino acids, that's going to get us what we need. And Infinite only has the branched chain amino acids. I'm more of a fan of all of the amino acids, and there's a capsule supplement that I use for that. But for a lot of people, they like the simplicity of just drinking one product, and so Infinite has the electrolytes, so we can dial that up or down depending on how much salt we think that you're losing, and there's tests you can do for that too. But I like Infinite for that reason, but I do encourage you to customize it, and you can customize the flavor. And I also encourage you, if you're doing an Ironman, to have 2 flavors. Have a flavor for the bike and a flavor for the run, because by the time you get off the bike, you're going to be so sick of it. It's hard to force that on the run. So having a flavor change, and even something maybe a little bit more savory can help. And I can't remember all the flavors that Infinite has, but some people will move to something, like if they're doing gels, like something like a salted caramel for maybe the run, because it has a little bit of that salty flavor, which tastes a lot better after you've been doing fruit forever. So, but this is kind of the option if we don't spend the time on figuring out what you need. So I apologize for the language, but I thought it was pretty funny. But so you really need to test, and test when you're training and make notes when you're training of how many calories you're taking in. So when I meet with a client, the first thing I'm going to do is ask them for a breakdown of how many calories they've taken in on a prior race. So that way we can start to formulate things. And then this is the testing that I do. And unfortunately, I'm not where you guys are, but I know some of you do travel to Colorado, so you could always build in a metabolic test with me and we could do this. But so basically this was my test again. So I usually race maybe at 130 heart rate, 135. And so here that would be 180 watts. And so I look here and I can see, so I just need to replace the blue line, which is carbohydrate. The green line is the fat. I'm carrying it. I can access it, no problem. So the blue, so we can replace between 10 to 30% comfortably of the carbohydrate calories we burn. So for me, that's 12 to 37 carbohydrate calories. That's all I need to take in. A lot of people don't believe me when I tell them that that's what I take in. So the last 3 Ironman races, I've taken in around 27 to 30 calories per hour, which is around, I think it was 350 calories for the entire race. And it sounds unbelievable, but I have the data here to show it. So, and I think, do you guys have Lifetime Fitness there?
Yes.
Yeah.
So Lifetime Fitness does this kind of test. And I don't know, but it would be really cool. If you guys did that, if I could get the raw data, I can do this for you, so that would be something maybe to look into, Nick.
Yeah.
Because it's a really helpful tool. And the thing that also happens is people, they have such peace of mind when they race, because they know, they have the data, they know it's right. So there's none of this guessing when you're out there. And it takes a lot of stress out of the pre-race planning. So I just wanted to talk quickly too about a program that I have coming up. So it's going to be a group program for endurance athletes. And there's going to be 4 online meetings. They're going to be each Tuesday in May. And they're going to be focused on improving metabolic flexibility for the upcoming race season. And the whole package includes 1 30-minute individual session with me. And so basically meeting 1 is going to really go into the daily diet. I'm going to give you a sample meal plan, recipes, and a much deeper dive in what you should be doing. And then meeting 2, we're going to talk about training. We're going to talk more about nutrient timing, exactly what you should be taking in for multiple training sessions. And then I'll give a lot more information on specific products. And then meeting 3 is going to be recovery and lifestyle hacks to prevent overtraining and injury. And because unfortunately overtraining is far too common but a lot of times it's because we're stressed with so many other things in life. We're not sleeping well, we're not eating well. So if we can do all those things, that can help us to be able to take on a bigger training load. And then the last meeting is going to be race day nutrition planning. And I give a race day planning template and more information on how to help with that. So questions?
Kirsten, you mentioned that aging females and those coming back from injury needed to up protein. Can you quantify that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm going to just make it bigger so I can see you more. So yeah, I would, for women, like once they get over, it depends kind of where they are in the life cycle, like after menopause and things like that. I'd want them to be at 25%. And even with men, but with men, it might not be till they get to say maybe like 60 or 70, and then coming back from injury. So if we have a fracture or a muscle tear, something like that, where we're trying to repair, then I would want the protein to be up at like 25%. And I think that's where collagen can be a really helpful thing. There's, I like Great Lakes collagen hydrolysate. It's grass-fed. You can get it on Amazon. That's a great product. So kind of trying to use those things. And then the super sport amino acids, those are a great product to use to kind of prevent the muscle breakdown, especially if people can't eat enough protein, they struggle to get it in. Taking those can give you sort of the same raw materials without having to do it. So does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Any
other questions?
All right, Kirsten, it looks like we're all wrapped up, but thank you very much for including us in your night and giving us all this information. And I know you said you probably sent out this PowerPoint to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll email it to you. And yeah, just let me know if any other questions pop up, during your training.
Send me the details. Send me the details on your the Tuesday meetings in May.
Okay.
I'll make sure that's posted to Facebook as well.
Okay, that sounds great.
All right.
All right. Well, happy training.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.